The morning of March 30th, 1945, I crawled 15 feet through the rear fuselage of a B-29 Superfortress, hunched low where the aluminum skin narrowed, then dropped to my knees for the final stretch on the wooden walkway. The tail gunner's compartment, my compartment now. 20 years old, fresh from gunnery school at Harlingen, Texas, and this cramped bubble of plexiglass and steel beneath the rudder would be my world for the next several hours. Through the curved glass, I could see the other superfortresses of the 19th Bombardment Group beginning to taxi at North Field, Guam. Massive silver machines, each one carrying 11 men and 20,000 pounds of bombs toward the Mitsubishi aircraft, works at Nagoya, Japan. I settled into the seat and ran my hands over the twin Browning M2 machine guns mounted before me. Half-inch caliber, Ma-Deuce, we called them. 5 feet 5 inches of American engineering that could punch through a quarter-inch of steel, plate at 500 yards. The guns moved when I touched the control stick, tracking smoothly left and right, up and down, responsive as a man's own arm. But unlike the gunners in the B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds I had trained beside, I was not merely pointing a weapon. I was connected to something far more sophisticated, a system. The General Electric Central Fire Control System, 5 analog computers distributed throughout our aircraft, each one calculating trajectories I could barely imagine. The briefing officer's words from 2 hours earlier still echoed in my mind. The fire control system gives your 50 caliber guns an effective range of 900 yards. That's 50% farther than manually aimed guns, more than twice the range of most Japanese fighter weapons. He had paused then, letting that sink in. When a zero closes to 400 yards to get a good shooting solution on you, you've already been in killing range for 500 yards. The computer does the math. You just keep the pipper on target. I checked my oxygen mask, tested the intercom. The pilot's voice crackled through. "Tail gunner, check in. Tail gunner, all systems green." I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. This was my first combat mission. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Our aircraft, one of 79 Superfortresses dispatched that morning, represented the culmination of 3 years of engineering that had cost the United States nearly $3 billion. More money than the Manhattan Project, more than any weapons program in human history. The B-29 was not simply a bomber. It was a statement of industrial will, a pressurized, computer-guided flying fortress designed to do what no other aircraft in the world could do. Carry massive bomb loads across vast distances at altitudes where the air grew so thin that enemy fighters struggled to climb, struggled to breathe, struggled to fight. The engines roared to life, 4 Wright R3000, 350 Cyclones generating 8,800 horsepower. Through my small window I watched Guam fall away beneath us, the coral runways of Northfield shrinking to white lines against green jungle and blue ocean. We climbed toward our cruising altitude of 26,000 feet, a height where the temperature outside would drop to 40 degrees below zero, where without the pressurized cabin we would lose consciousness in seconds. But inside, heated and pressurized, I could move freely in my heated suit, my fingers able to work the controls without the crippling cold that B-17 waist gunners endured. I checked my oxygen mask, tested the intercom. The pilot's voice crackled through. "Tail gunner, check in. Tail gunner, all systems green," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. This was my first combat mission. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Our aircraft, one of 79 Superfortresses dispatched that morning, represented the culmination of 3 years of engineering that had cost the United States nearly $3 billion. More money than the Manhattan Project, more than any weapons program in human history. The B-29 was not simply a bomber. It was a statement of industrial will, a pressurized, computer-guided flying fortress designed to do what no other aircraft in the world could do. Carry massive bomb loads across vast distances at altitudes where the air grew so thin that enemy fighters struggled to climb, struggled to breathe, struggled to fight. The engines roared to life, 4 Wright R3000, 350 Cyclones generating 8,800 horsepower. Through my small window I watched Guam fall away beneath us, the coral runways of North Field shrinking to white lines against green jungle and blue ocean. We climbed toward our cruising altitude of 26,000 feet, a height where the temperature outside would drop to 40 degrees below zero, where without the pressurized cabin we would lose consciousness in seconds. But inside, heated and pressurized, I could move freely in my heated suit, my fingers able to work the controls without the crippling cold that B-17 waist gunners endured. The idea that aircraft could bomb an enemy into submission was not new in 1945, but the scale of what we intended was unprecedented. For 3 years, American industry had poured its resources into creating a weapon that could reach across the Pacific Ocean and strike at the heart of the Japanese Empire. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress represented the answer to a question posed in January 1940 when the Army Air Corps issued requirements for a very long-range bomber. The requirements were audacious: a range of 4,000 miles, a bomb load of 20,000 pounds, a cruising speed of 230 miles per hour, and a combat ceiling above 30,000 feet. Boeing's design, selected in September 1940, pushed every boundary of aeronautical engineering. The fuselage was pressurized, a feature that had existed in only 10 commercial airliners before the war. The wing was long and narrow, with an aspect ratio that allowed the aircraft to cruise efficiently at high altitude while maintaining stable handling during takeoff and landing. The landing gear used dual wheels in a tricycle configuration, eliminating the tail wheel that made the B-24 Liberator notoriously unstable on the ground. But the most revolutionary element was the defensive armament system. Earlier heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress carried 13 half-inch machine guns positioned at 9 locations around the aircraft. Gunners sat in open waist positions, freezing in the -40-degree cold, manually tracking targets while compensating for wind, for the bomber's speed, for gravity, for the motion of attacking fighters. It was brutal work. The B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds flew in tight formations, creating overlapping fields of fire that could shred attacking fighters, but they still required fighter escorts for most of their missions over Europe. Without those escorts, bomber losses could be catastrophic. The B-29 took a different approach. Instead of placing gunners directly at the weapons, General Electric developed a remote control system that allowed 5 gunners, seated at comfortable stations inside the pressurized fuselage, to control 4 turrets positioned at strategic points on the aircraft's exterior. Each turret held 2 half-inch Browning machine guns. The tail position, where I sat, had 2 more Brownings and in early models a 20mm cannon, though the cannon was being removed from most aircraft due to sighting problems. But the true innovation was not the remote control itself, it was the computers. Each of the 5 sighting stations connected to its own analog computer, a General Electric creation built at their plant in Erie, Pennsylvania. These computers, each weighing about 50 pounds, were marvels of 1940s engineering. When I placed my gun sight's reticle on an attacking fighter and tracked it briefly, the computer received information about the target's angular velocity. It combined this with data about our own airspeed, our altitude, the outside air temperature, the humidity. It calculated how far a bullet would drop over the distance to the target. At 800 yards, a half-inch bullet drops almost 14 feet. At 900 yards, even more. The computer factored in parallax error, the difference in angle between my sighting position and the actual location of the guns. It calculated lead, the amount I needed to aim ahead of a fast-moving target. A fighter closing at 400 miles per hour required the guns to aim as much as 200 yards ahead of where it appeared in my sight. The computer did all of this continuously, in real time, adjusting the aim of the guns so that when I pressed the firing button, the bullets would arrive exactly where the enemy fighter would be when they got there. The effective range of our weapons more than doubled. Manual gunners on B-17 seconds could engage targets reliably at 400 to 500 yards. Our computer-aimed guns were effective at 900 yards. Some gunners claimed successful engagements at 1,000 yards, though at that distance, even the computer's calculations became approximate. The system allowed any gunner to control multiple turrets. If I, as the tail gunner, was not engaged, I could transfer control to one of the waist gunners. If the bombardier in the nose was busy with the bomb run, another gunner could take over his forward turrets. The central fire control gunner, seated at the raised position we called the barber chair, coordinated the distribution of firepower, ensuring that no two gunners tried to control the same turret simultaneously, preventing confusion in the chaos of combat. We had been told in training that this system made us nearly invulnerable. The briefing films showed cartoon representations of B-29 gunners shooting down Japanese fighters with the press of a button, enemy aircraft exploding at impossible distances while the Superfortress cruised serenely through the sky. Major General Curtis LeMay, who commanded our 21st Bomber Command from the Marianas, had stated it plainly. These big boys can take care of themselves. Fighter escorts were no longer strictly necessary. We were told that on a raid over Kyushu in June 1944, a single B-29 crew had fought off 79 Japanese fighters, downing 7. Another report described a B-29 surviving a 275-mile running battle against 80 Japanese aircraft. The mathematics of the computer, the range of our weapons, the altitude at which we operated, all of it was supposed to make us untouchable. The Japanese fighters we expected to face, the Mitsubishi A6M0, the Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, the Kawasaki Ki-61 Hien, were formidable aircraft at medium altitudes. But at 25 or 30,000 feet, their performance degraded dramatically. Their engines, not equipped with the sophisticated turbochargers our Wright Cyclones possessed, gasped in the thin air. A Zero that could climb to 19,700 feet in 7 minutes at sea level struggled to reach 25,000 feet at all, and when it did, it arrived with barely enough power to maneuver. Meanwhile, our Superfortress cruised comfortably at 26,000 feet at 250 miles per hour, faster than most Japanese fighters could fly at that altitude. This was the promise we carried with us as we climbed toward Japan that March morning. Not merely bombs to destroy factories, but a weapons system so advanced that the enemy could not effectively challenge it. We believed in the computers. We believed in the statistics. We believed that the engineering excellence of American industry had given us an insurmountable advantage. As the coast of Japan appeared on the horizon, a dark line separating ocean from sky, I checked my guns one final time and waited for the fighters to come. The first Japanese fighter appeared 37 minutes after we crossed the coast. I saw it before the formation did, a small silhouette rising from below at our 7 o'clock position, perhaps 2,000 feet lower and climbing hard, a Mitsubishi A6M0. I recognized the profile immediately from the recognition cards we had studied, the graceful elliptical wing, the long nose, the lightweight construction that made it so maneuverable. I called it out on the intercom. Tail to crew, fighter at 7 o'clock low, climbing. My voice sounded mechanical, disconnected. I had trained for this moment for months, but now that it was here, my hands moved through the procedures with a strange automaticity. I dialed the Zero's known wingspan into my sight, 56 feet. The reticle in my gun sight displayed a circle of dots that I needed to match to the fighter's wingspan. I placed the center pipper on the Zero and began tracking it, adjusting the range wheel to keep the circle of dots spanning the aircraft as it climbed toward us. The computer was receiving the information now, calculating range, calculating closure rate, calculating lead. The guns moved beneath me, tracking independently of where my sight pointed, angling to where the computer determined the Zero would be when the bullets arrived. The Zero reached our altitude 400 yards behind us and leveled off. I waited. The briefing officer's words repeated in my mind. Effective range 900 yards, twice the range of the enemy's weapons, but the computer needed tracking data. I kept the Zero centered in my sight, kept the circle of dots matched to its wingspan, watched it begin, a shallow turn to position for an attack run. Then it accelerated toward us, closing the distance rapidly. At 700 yards, I pressed the firing trigger. The Browning machine guns hammered, 400 rounds per minute from each weapon. The vibration transmitted through the airframe, but muted by the pressurized compartment. I watched the tracers arc out behind us, the computer's calculations made visible in streams of phosphorescent fire. They passed ahead of the Zero. The computer was leading the target, aiming at where it would be, and for a moment I felt a surge of confidence. This was working. The system was working exactly as designed. The Zero did not slow. It did not break off. It continued its approach, and now it was at 600 yards. My guns tracked, the computer adjusting constantly, and I fired again, longer bursts now, watching the tracers reach out and again pass just ahead of the Zero's nose. The fighter jinked slightly, a small evasive maneuver, and kept coming. 500 yards, 450. Then I saw the Zero's wing guns begin to flash. Small winks of light, orange muzzle flashes, and I realized with a cold clarity that the Japanese pilot was firing at 450 yards. He was inside my effective range, and he was shooting. More important, he was closing deliberately, trading his theoretical range disadvantage for something else. What? The answer came immediately. At 400 yards, the Zero banked hard, presenting its full wingspan broadside to me for just an instant, and then it flashed past below us at tremendous speed, close enough that I glimpsed the meatball insignia on its fuselage, the exhaust stacks on the engine cowling, the blur of the spinning propeller. The entire encounter had lasted perhaps 45 seconds. I had fired roughly 200 rounds. The Zero had not been hit. It had not been damaged. It had made a deliberate firing pass against a B-29 Superfortress, against the most advanced defensive weapons system in the world, and it had survived completely intact. They came from multiple directions, sometimes singly, sometimes in pairs. Zeros, mostly, but also Kawasaki Ki-61 Hyans, called Tonys by our intelligence officers. The Ki-61 seconds were faster, more heavily armed, and they attacked with a calculated aggression that suggested experienced pilots. I fired at 3 more aircraft. The central fire control gunner called out vectors over the intercom, coordinating our defensive fire. The other gunners engaged targets on their side of the formation. The machine guns hammered continuously, the computers calculated endlessly, and the Japanese fighters continued to press their attacks. None of them were shot down, not one. I watched a Zero make a head-on pass against a B, 29 inches, the lead element, its wing cannons firing, saw it pull up and over at the last possible moment to avoid collision. I watched a Ki-61 dive from above, rake a Superfortress with gunfire, and disappear below us before any of our turrets could track it effectively. The fighters were not maintaining distance. They were not respecting the supposed 900-yard advantage our computers gave us. They were closing to 400 yards, to 300, to ranges where the computer's calculations became irrelevant, because by the time the system processed the information and adjusted the gun's aim, the fighter had already altered course or flashed past out of the engagement envelope. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Then, approximately 50 minutes into the engagement, my upper rear turret stopped responding. I was tracking a Zero at 500 yards when the gun simply ceased moving. The motors that drove the turret had failed, or the computer had malfunctioned, or somewhere in the intricate web of electrical connections and analog calculations, something had broken. I flipped the transfer switch, attempting to pass control to one of the waist gunners. Nothing. The turret was dead. In a B-17, a gunner could access his weapons during flight, could clear a jam, could reset a malfunction. In the B-29, the turrets were external to the pressurized fuselage. They were sealed, remote, untouchable. If they failed, they remained failed until we returned to base. I reported the malfunction to the central fire control gunner. His response was clipped, professional, acknowledged, focus on tail defense. But I heard something else in his voice. Not surprise. This was not the first turret to malfunction on this mission. The elaborate system we had trusted, the system that had cost $3 billion to develop and deploy, was proving far more fragile than the training films had suggested. The bombing run over Nagoya lasted 11 minutes. The flak was intense, black bursts of shrapnel that peppered the formation, and I heard the sharp pings of metal, fragments striking our fuselage. The bombardier released our load, 20,000 pounds of high-explosive bombs, tumbling away toward the Mitsubishi aircraft works below. Then we turned for the long flight home. The Japanese fighters shadowed us for another 20 minutes before breaking off, presumably low on fuel. As they departed, I made a mental count of what I had witnessed. Our formation of 79 B-29 seconds had been engaged by perhaps 30 to 40 Japanese fighters. We had fired thousands of rounds from our computer-guided guns. The other aircraft in the formation had done the same. The radios crackled with excited voices claiming hits, claiming probables, but from my position I had not seen a single confirmed kill. Not one Japanese aircraft trailing smoke, not one spinning toward Earth, not one exploding in midair. The fighters had attacked with near impunity, had damaged several B-29 seconds in our formation, and had withdrawn intact. 5 aircraft from our group did not return. To Guam, 55 men. On April 7th, 73 B-29 seconds attacked the aircraft factories at Nagoya again. Japanese fighters made more than 100 aggressive passes against the formation. 9 Superfortresses were shot down. 99 men dead or captured in a single mission. The gunners claimed multiple kills, but reconnaissance photographs and post-mission analysis could not confirm them. The Japanese fighters continued to operate with tactical sophistication that belied our intelligence estimates about their training and experience. They attacked from the sun. They coordinated their approaches to overwhelm defensive fire. They exploited the blind spots in our fields of fire, particularly the area directly beneath the B-29, where none of our turrets could track effectively. The computer system, revolutionary though it was, suffered from problems that had not manifested in testing but became critical in combat. The analog computers were sensitive to vibration. Act of firing. The machine guns created enough jar to knock the delicate electrical components out of alignment. A targeting solution that was accurate for the first burst would degrade with continued firing. The computers compensated for gravity, for wind, for parallax, for lead, but they could not compensate for their own deterioration under combat conditions. The fire control system had been developed by 4 different companies, each working on separate components, then integrated into a single unit without sufficient testing under realistic combat loads. It was intricate, it was expensive, it was impressive. When it worked properly, it extended our effective range significantly. Most often, it did not work properly. Maintenance crews on Guam struggled to keep the systems operational. The computers required constant calibration, the turret motors burned out, the electrical connections corroded in the salt air. A single malfunction anywhere in the chain of sights, computers, motors, and guns could disable an entire turret, and there was no way to repair it during flight. The pressurized fuselage that kept us comfortable at altitude also sealed the turrets beyond our reach. B-17 and B-24. Gunners could physically access their weapons, could clear jams, could troubleshoot problems in real time. We could only watch our remote-controlled systems fail and continue the mission with reduced firepower. By late April, the statistics told a story that contradicted everything we had been promised in training. 11,000 Japanese fighter attacks had been recorded against B-29 formations. Gunners claimed 914 enemy aircraft destroyed, 456 probably destroyed, and 770 damaged. But post-war analysis would reveal these numbers to be significant overclaims, typical of the confusion and multiple sightings inherent in aerial combat. Meanwhile, Japanese fighters had accounted for 13% of all battle damage to B-29 seconds. More critically, the tactical calculus had shifted. The Japanese pilots had learned they could survive attacks against the Superfortress if they closed rapidly to ranges where our supposed advantage disappeared. Major General Curtis LeMay understood this better than most. In early March 1945, he issued orders that fundamentally acknowledged the failure of our defensive systems. For the low-altitude incendiary raids that would devastate Japan's cities, he ordered most of the defensive armament removed from B-29 seconds. The forward turrets, the waist turrets, the elaborate fire control computers, all stripped out to save weight and allow for increased bomb loads. Only the tail guns remained. The Superfortress, designed as an impregnable flying fortress, was going into combat essentially defenseless, relying on darkness and low altitude to avoid fighters rather than on its revolutionary weapons systems. The computer-controlled guns had been supposed to keep Japanese fighters at bay beyond their effective range. Instead, we learned that engineering superiority was not the same as tactical superiority. That a 900-yard effective range meant nothing if the enemy closed to 300 yards before you could react. That complexity was a liability when reliability mattered more than sophistication. The promise had been invincibility. The reality was compromise, adaptation, and survival through means the designers had never intended. I flew 32 combat missions between March and August 1945. Of those 32 missions, I experienced complete failure of at least one turret system on 19 occasions. Partial malfunctions, where the computer calculated incorrectly or the guns tracked erratically, occurred on virtually every mission. The revolutionary fire control system that had been promised as our salvation became instead a source of constant frustration and tactical compromise. We adapted. We learned to fire shorter bursts, minimize vibration damage to the computers. We learned to identify the ranges at which the system worked most reliably and to hold fire until fighters entered that envelope. We learned, most importantly, that our survival depended less on technological superiority than on factors the engineers had never anticipated. The skill of our pilots, the courage to continue missions despite mechanical failures, and ultimately the strategic decision to abandon high-altitude daylight precision bombing in favor of low-altitude night incendiary raids. The statistics told a sobering story. From November 1944 to August 1945, the 20th Air Force operating from the Marianas lost 447 B-29 seconds. 343 of those aircraft were lost to combat causes. 11% of all aircraft over target were lost or damaged during this period. The loss rate was 1.2% per sortie, which sounds small until you calculate what it meant for individual crews. Most crewmen were assigned to fly 35 missions, the standard tour of duty. A 1.2% loss rate per mission meant that your cumulative probability of being shot down over a full tour approached 35%. 1 in 3 crews would not complete their tours. Japanese fighters accounted for 13% of all battle damage to B-29 seconds. This figure, often cited to suggest the fighters were not a significant threat, concealed a more complex reality. The majority of damage came from anti-aircraft fire, 76%, but the fighters forced tactical decisions that exposed us to that flak. When fighters attacked aggressively, formations had to break, defensive systems had to be maintained despite their weight penalty, and bomb runs had to be executed under combat conditions that degraded accuracy. The fighters did not need to shoot down large numbers of B-29 seconds to be effective. They needed only to exist as a credible threat. The gunners claimed impressive numbers. 714 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 456 probably destroyed, 770 damaged. Post-war analysis would reveal these claims to be significant overcounts, typical of combat reporting where multiple gunners engaged the same target and each claimed credit, where damaged aircraft were reported as destroyed, where the chaos of battle created impossible certainty. The actual number of Japanese aircraft destroyed by B-29 defensive fire remains disputed, but most historians place it significantly lower than the wartime claims. What is certain is that the defensive gunnery did not achieve its primary objective of keeping Japanese fighters at bay beyond their effective range. By February 1945, General Curtis LeMay made the decision that acknowledged what we had learned through hard experience. For the low-altitude incendiary raids that would devastate Japan's cities and ultimately force surrender, he ordered the removal of most defensive armament from B-29 seconds. The forward turrets, the waist turrets, the elaborate central fire control computers, all were stripped out. Only the tail guns remained. The weight saved allowed us to carry more bombs and more fuel. The Superfortress, designed as the ultimate expression of defensive firepower, went to war essentially defenseless. This decision was vindicated by results. The incendiary raids succeeded not because of our defensive systems but despite their absence. We flew at night, at low altitude, accepting the vulnerability in exchange for increased payload and the cover of darkness. Japan's night fighter force was weak, their radar inadequate, their coordination poor. We burned their cities with relative impunity, losing fewer aircraft than during the high-altitude daylight missions when all our defensive systems were operational. To put this in perspective, the Manhattan Project, the effort that produced the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, cost $2.2 billion. The United States spent more money developing and producing the B-29 Superfortress than it spent splitting the atom. This massive investment produced approximately 3,900 aircraft, making each B-29 the most expensive weapons system of World War II. The unit cost was $639,000 per aircraft, nearly 3 times the cost of a B-17 Flying Fortress. The pressurized cabin, the remote-controlled turrets, the analog fire control computers all contributed to this astronomical expense. The question that haunted post-war analysis was whether this investment achieved its intended purpose. The B-29 offensive against Japan was ultimately successful. By August 1945, the bombardment had destroyed a high percentage of Japanese industry, wrecked their economy, and shattered civilian morale. 169 square miles in 66 cities were reduced to ash. The 2 atomic weapons delivered by specially modified B-29 seconds forced Japan's surrender without the necessity of invasion. 27,611 bombing sorties dropped 104,000 tons of bombs. Japan surrendered while possessing more than 2.5 million combat-equipped troops and 9,000 kamikaze aircraft in the home islands. They surrendered not because they lacked the means to fight, but because continued resistance had become pointless. But the success of the B-29 campaign came despite the failure of its defensive systems, not because of them. The aircraft that forced Japan's surrender were not the high-altitude, computer-defended fortresses of 1944. They were stripped-down bomb carriers flying low-altitude night missions, relying on darkness and surprise rather than defensive firepower. The $3 billion investment had produced an airframe capable of reaching Japan from the Marianas, pressurized compartments that allowed crews to operate at extreme altitude, and engines powerful enough to carry massive bomb loads across vast distances. These capabilities were revolutionary and essential. But the elaborate defensive systems, the analog computers that extended gun range to 900 yards, the remote-controlled turrets that were supposed to make fighter attacks suicidal, these proved to be expensive complications that added weight, required constant maintenance, and failed when most needed. The lessons learned influenced bomber design for decades afterward. When Boeing developed the B-52 Stratofortress in the 1950s, it incorporated a tailgun position but abandoned the concept of multiple remote-controlled turrets. The emphasis shifted to speed, altitude, and eventually electronic countermeasures rather than defensive armament. By the 1960s, tailguns were removed from most strategic bombers entirely. The B-1 and B-2 bombers of later generations carried no defensive guns whatsoever. Stealth, speed, standoff weapons, and electronic warfare became the tools of bomber defense. The B-29's elaborate fire control system was recognized as a technological dead end, an impressive achievement in analog computation that nonetheless represented an incorrect solution to the fundamental problem of bomber vulnerability. The crews who flew the B-29's combat had a more nuanced understanding than the post-war analysts. We knew the defensive systems were flawed, but we also knew they provided psychological comfort during missions when psychological factors mattered enormously. We knew the computers often failed, but we had witnessed moments when they worked brilliantly, when a burst of fire reached out impossibly far and drove off an attacker. We knew that stripped-down bombers flying night missions took fewer casualties, but we remembered missions where our guns had saved us, when fighters found us in daylight. The truth was more complex than simple success or failure. It was adaptation under pressure, the eternal struggle between engineering promise and combat reality, between what weapons were designed to do and what they actually accomplished when tested by an enemy who had his own ideas about how battles should be fought. I returned to the United States in September 1945, 3 weeks after Japan's surrender. 20 years old, a staff sergeant with an Air Medal and a Distinguished Flying Cross, I had survived what many had not. Of the 11 men in my original crew, 9 returned home. Our bombardier was killed when flak tore through the nose compartment over Osaka. Our right waist gunner was badly wounded on our 28th mission and evacuated to a hospital in Guam. He survived the war but lost his left arm. The crew of the B-29 that flew wing position to us on my first mission over Nagoya did not come back. 11 men gone in a single afternoon. I learned their names only after we returned to base, because in combat, you did not permit yourself to know too much about the crews around you. The 19th Bombardment Group lost 42 aircraft during the war, 462 men. Some were shot down over Japan and became prisoners of war, subjected to treatment that violated every convention of civilized warfare. Some ditched in the Pacific Ocean and were never found. Some died when their aircraft crashed on takeoff, victims of engine fires or mechanical failures rather than enemy action. The B-29 killed its own crews with disturbing regularity. The Wright R 3,350 engines with their magnesium crankcases would catch fire, and 87% of the time the onboard fire extinguishers could not put out the flames. The fire would burn through the firewall into the wing spar in 90 seconds, and the wing would fail catastrophically. This happened during combat missions and training flights, and routine ferrying operations. It happened so often that we developed dark jokes about it, because humor was one of the few tools we had to manage the constant awareness of mortality. The broader statistics from the Pacific Air War provide context for individual experience. Between June 1944 and August 1945, B-29 crews were credited with shooting down 871 Japanese aircraft. Though this figure certainly included overclaims and duplications common in combat reporting, the B-29 seconds themselves lost 402 aircraft to all causes. The exchange ratio seems favorable until you remember that each B-29 carried 11 men while each Japanese fighter carried 1. We were winning by the numbers, but the cost remained high in absolute terms. 4,422 American airmen died in B-29 operations. Another 8,403 were wounded. 9,838 became prisoners of war. These were not statistics when they happened. They were friends, crewmates, the men you had breakfast with before a mission and never saw again. What does it mean that the most advanced bomber defense system of World War II succeeded strategically while failing tactically? It means that wars are won by persistence and industrial capacity and the willingness to adapt when initial plans prove inadequate. The B-29's revolutionary fire control system represented the cutting edge of analog computation, a technological achievement that would influence future weapon systems even as its specific implementation proved impractical. The remote turrets, the pressurized crew compartments, the long-range capabilities, all these innovations contributed to the aircraft's success. But the lesson I carried from 32 combat missions was simpler and harder than any engineering analysis. Technology provides advantages. It does not provide certainty. The Japanese fighters that were supposed to remain at respectful distances beyond our 900-yard effective range did not cooperate with our assumptions. They closed to 300 yards because closing was the only tactical option that gave them a chance against a larger, faster, better armed opponent. They adapted to our technology faster than our technology adapted to their tactics. In the end, we won not because our defensive systems worked as designed, but because we carried enough bombs to burn their cities, because we had enough industrial capacity to replace losses, and because they finally concluded that further resistance was futile. The computers that calculated trajectories with such precision could not calculate the human dimension of warfare. That remains true today. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.